Predicted changes in global temperatures and precipitation due to climate change have the potential to drastically alter forest structure and function. Hello, I am Stephen Burr, a graduate student in the School of Forestry at Northern Arizona University, and I will be your host as we discuss predictions of climate change and possible impacts on tree species distribution and stand structure along forested ecotones in the Southwest. Specifically, I will give a brief description of possible mechanisms that could alter the distribution of ponderosa pine and pinyon juniper stands in this region. Climate change in the region of North America can more accurately be described as warming trends and reductions in annual precipitation. It has been argued the effects of climate change will be most rapid and extreme along ecotones, areas of transition between biomes. This argument is not without precedent. A study examining an ecotone between ponderosa pine stands and stands of pinyon juniper in the Bandelier Wilderness of the Jemez Mountains of northern New Mexico has been conducted. This study focused on ponderosa pine mortality due to severe drought which occurred from 1954 to 1958, and a consequent vegetative shift as stands once dominated by ponderosa pine were colonized by pinyon juniper. This shift marked an advance of greater than 2 kilometers in less than 5 years of pinyon juniper stands into higher elevations once held by ponderosa pine. This change in species dominance has persisted into the 21st century. An additional study compared the drought experienced in the southwestern United States in 2002 to 2003 to the previous drought of the 1950s, specifically examining drought-induced die-off of ponderosa and pinyon pines. Results indicate that though the 1950s drought was more severe, meaning less precipitation, the 2002-2003 drought was accompanied by higher temperatures. This combination of drought and high temperatures led to more extensive tree mortality compared to the mid-20th century drought in the same region. Based on the aforementioned studies, if predicted climate changes come to pass, we will expect to see further transitions of species dominance along the ecotones of the Southwest. It is therefore important for forest managers to understand the mechanisms at work in these possible transitions, to understand the causes of tree stress, the physiological responses of the tree species involved, and the primary causes of tree mortality under predicted changing environmental conditions. Armed with this knowledge, managers will be better prepared for working the stands of the Southwest in the latter half of the 21st century. A general broad description of plant species categorizes plants based on adaptations and physiological responses to increases in temperatures and prolonged droughts. Categories are isohydric and anisohydric species. Isohydric or drought-resistant plants are characterized as keeping tight control of water loss via stomatal closure during times of drought. The drier the air surrounding the plant, the more evaporative pressure is placed upon the plant's water-conducting tissue, or xylem. If the pressure on the xylem becomes too great, the xylem becomes vulnerable to cavitation, or the introduction of air pockets into the conductive tissue. Air pockets restrict the plant's ability to move water, which can lead to hydraulic failure of the xylem and eventual death of the plant. Drought-resistant species combat this water loss by closing their stomates, thereby reducing the pressures placed upon their conductive tissues and reducing the threat of cavitation. The one caveat to this adaptation is that stomatal closure also restricts the plant's ability to intake carbon, which is necessary for photosynthesis and the production of essential sugars necessary to fuel the plant's metabolism. Therefore, stomatal closure can protect the isohydric plants from hydraulic failure during times of drought. But prolonged drought can deplete a plant's carbon reserves, leading to carbon starvation and eventual death. So length of drought is very important in the isohydric plant's survival. Anisohydric, or drought-tolerant species, do not maintain such tight control of their water status, but rather are capable of withstanding more negative water pressures due to more resistant xylem compared to their isohydric counterparts. This means that despite increasing evaporative pressure being placed upon the plant's conductive tissues, drought-tolerant species resist xylem cavitation and continue conducting photosynthesis during drought conditions long after isohydric plants have stopped. This adaptation of resistant xylem allows drought-tolerant species to occupy more drought-prone environments than their drought-resistant counterparts. The drawback of this adaptation is if a drought becomes too severe, drought-tolerant species do become vulnerable to hydraulic failure because they operate within a narrow hydraulic safety margin. So severity of drought, more than length of drought, is very important in anisohydric plants' survival. Now that I have described differing strategies utilized by plants during drought, I will examine a common ecotone in the Southwest. Pinyon juniper stands are common in this semi-arid region. Prior to European settlement, fire may have been a major component of these stands, but anthropogenic fire suppression has reduced fire frequency. Currently, disturbances within these areas are believed to be the result of direct drought impacts and insect infestation. As the geography transitions into higher elevations, temperatures cool and soil water becomes more prevalent. Pinyon juniper are commonly outcompeted by ponderosa pine. It is at these points of transition I will theorize the likely shifts in species composition, given the predicted changes in climate, and the mechanisms likely to play key roles within these transition zones. Both ponderosa and pinyon pines are classified as isohydric or drought-resistant species, while juniper is anisohydric or drought-tolerant. Juniper is generally considered to be more drought-tolerant than pinyon pine, and likewise, pinyon pine is considered to be more drought-tolerant than ponderosa pine. Juniper's greater drought tolerance compared to the two pine species is based on juniper's ability to withstand prolonged periods of drought. While the isohydric species have closed their stomates to reduce water loss, anisohydric juniper continues with stomates open. The water-conducting tissue of juniper species can function at much higher evaporative pressure without reducing carbon intake, while the pine species must restrict the intake of carbon to prevent water loss. Prolonged drought can lead to carbon starvation in the pines and eventual death, while juniper will persist during these periods of increasing aridity. The exact mechanism conferring greater resistance to pinyon over ponderosa pine is currently unknown. Pinyon shoots are in fact more vulnerable to cavitation than ponderosa, indicating that the greater drought resistance of pinyon over ponderosa pine cannot be explained by xylem vulnerability to cavitation. It is possible that the greater observed resistance of pinyon pine could be due to tree architecture. Smaller stature and canopy of pinyon pines could be indicators of less whole plant water use. Additionally, small stature could also indicate a smaller ratio of photosynthetic to non-photosynthetic tissue in the tree, reducing respiration and uptake carbon costs. Regardless, pinyon pine is often found in more arid environments than ponderosa pine. Given the physiology of the three species, if temperatures rise and drought becomes common along northern Arizona ecotones, we would expect the following to take place. During the initial stages of climate change, few if any alterations in stand composition will be observed. The pine species will adjust to the warmer, drying climate by closing their stomates, thereby reducing their water loss within the changing climate. The impact on pinyon pines and juniper trees will be negligible at this stage. As the change in climate progresses, pines will be forced to close their stomates for longer and longer periods, reducing their intake of carbon, forcing ponderosa pine to tap into their carbon reserves. Carbon-fueled metabolic processes are an important part in tree defenses against invading insects. Environmental factors such as prolonged drought can diminish a tree's ability to defend itself against such attacks. It will be at this point that weakened ponderosa pines at lower elevations may experience mortality due to bark beetle attack. If pinyon pines do indeed have higher carbon use efficiency, then these prolonged periods of stomatal closure will have less of an adverse impact on these trees. Pinyon pines will subsist on a reduced carbon influx imposed under the changing environmental conditions. Regardless of the exact mechanisms conferring drought resistance to pinyon pines, pinyon pine and junipers will be less stressed than their ponderosa pine counterparts, and therefore be less vulnerable to attack. As growing space opens due to ponderosa pine mortality, these areas are likely to be colonized by pinyon and juniper. As warming trends continue, more ponderosa pine will become stressed due to reduced intake of carbon. The abundance of stressed ponderosa pines on the landscape could lead to an increase in successful attacks by colonizing bark beetle populations. Longer warm periods could lead to increases in the number of beetle generations per year, and warmer winters could reduce beetle mortality over the colder months. In time, increases in beetle numbers could lead beetle populations to grow to outbreak levels, causing mortality of tens of thousands of ponderosa pine in just a few years. Pinyon pines and juniper are not susceptible to the same species of tree-killing bark beetles as ponderosa, so they will not be impacted by the beetle outbreak. There are species of tree-killing bark beetles that attack pinyon pines, but if the trees are not stressed, they will be less vulnerable to colonization. Pinyon pines and juniper will move into the growing space vacated by the beetle-killed ponderosa pines. Pinyon juniper stands will be more resistant to the warmer, drier environment, and a large-scale shift will take place, pushing ponderosa pine up in elevation where environmental conditions are more hospitable, and pinyon and juniper will colonize the lands below. Research suggests a transition to more arid climate in the southwestern United States. If models are accurate, the levels of aridity of the multi-year drought experienced in the 1950s will replace the current climatology in the southwest within the coming decades. Another study found that using a forest drought stress index from the southwest predominantly influenced by warming season vapor pressure deficit and cold season precipitation, predicts that by 2050, the mean forest drought stress index will exceed the most severe droughts of the past 1,000 years. If these predictions are accurate, we could see a large-scale transition of species in the Southwest. Prolonged drought could further lead to a transition from pinyon juniper stands to pure juniper stands, as pinyon pine eventually succumbs to the increasing drought and insect attack. The possible repercussions of these transitions to other species of plants and wildlife is unknown, but could set the stage for ripple effects throughout the regional trophic levels, impacting countless species. This has been Stephen Burr, discussing predictions of climate change and possible impacts on tree species distribution and stand structure along forested ecotones in the Southwest. I hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and I now invite you to step outside and experience the awe and wonder of the natural world. Thank you.